Hi, I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. We've spoken quite a lot in this class about the effects that people have on the environment. I'd like to turn that around a bit in two ways. Firstly, I'd like to consider the question, how do people depend on the environment? What are the services that the environment provides that we need to survive? And secondly, I'd like to think about the ethical nature of the environment and nature generally. Does nature and the things in nature have values beyond those that help humans and our goals? So we'll look at both of those issues in this lecture. One of the threats to sustainable life on this planet is the loss of species individually and ecosystems generally. The organisms themselves and the habitats they live in are very important in the quality of life for everybody on this planet. Why is this a threat to sustainability? Is there a way that we can measure or quantify the impacts of losses of species or ecosystems in the context of the sustainability of social systems? To begin to answer that question, we need a measure of how successful biological systems are at functioning. One way to do this is to use the idea of biodiversity. This measures the variability in not just individual species, but genes and genomes, all the way up to the whole level of ecosystems. Here's a definition. The variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Single ecosystems can support a very wide variety of species. For example, if we take the case of the Cerrado dry forest in Brazil, there are over 10,000 species of plants, almost 200 species of mammals, 600 species of birds, and about 800 species of fish. Generally, biodiversity is greatest in rainforest regions, but in fact, biodiversity hotspots are found all over the world. If we look at this map, we can see places from almost every continent except Antarctica. The green areas are the original biodiversity hotspots and the blue areas were more recently added. One way that scientists can measure biodiversity is by examining the fate of individual species within ecosystems. Scientists who do this say that the world is losing species and the rate of loss appears to be accelerating in many taxonomic groups. This is according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. These estimates are largely based on loss of habitat. Around 1 in 5 mammal species and about 1 in 7 bird species are considered endangered because of this loss of habitat. As humans have converted natural areas to our own use, to farming, places to live, pastureland, there is less room for non-human species to exist. This has resulted in habitat destruction and fragmentation, and other effects that have caused damage to ecosystems include invasive species, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident, overexploitation of natural resources, for example, logging of forests, and sometimes it's a question of habitat or ecosystem degradation. Classically, this has been seen through pollution, and the big fear for the 21st century is that climate change will cause large-scale ecosystem disruption. Another reason why we might focus on ecosystem level functions instead of individual species levels is that individual species can become locally extinct. If they're locally extinct, then this means that they no longer contribute to that local ecosystem. A good example of this in North America is local wolf populations. Wolves have never really been in danger of becoming extinct, but in many local places they are entirely removed. For example, in Yellowstone Park. This changed the features of the ecosystem. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in the 1990s, this reduced the local caribou population, which in turn reduced pressure on native plants, which were then able to grow back. So by introducing species that had been lost from that natural ecosystem, it was able to more closely return to its original state. So in this sense, it doesn't matter if there are wolves elsewhere. What matters is that there are wolves in that local ecosystem. So we might not just be concerned with the fate of individual species globally, but also individual species locally. So what's the current situation with biodiversity? Well, in many places around the world, it's been severely reduced due to human action. For example, in this part of the American Midwest, there's been an almost complete removal of tall grass prairie. And if we look more broadly across the Midwest, about 90% of the original tall grass prairie habitat has been completely destroyed. One very telling statistic is that about 25% of the Earth's surface is now used for agriculture. Tropical rainforests, which are a very important habitat, nearly half of the world's plants and animal species are found in rainforests, covered about 4 billion acres of the Earth originally, and now that's down to about 2.5 billion acres. And furthermore, about 1% of the world's rainforests are lost every year. Another very important ecosystem for biodiversity is wetlands, and about half of the world's wetlands have also been destroyed. So what's the cost of losing these natural ecosystems? Well, one way that has been used to measure this cost is through a term known as ecosystem services. An example of an ecosystem service is a wetland that purifies water. Another might be a forest that provides oxygen for the air, or an ocean that provides habitat for fish. This list of ecosystems is, of course, enormous. And if we were to try and value this, we'd get very large numbers. One study suggested that the value of natural capital was between 16 and 54 trillion US dollars per year, with an average of around 33 trillion US dollars per year. But of course, the total value of ecosystem services is beyond measure, because nothing can live outside of nature. It's still worthwhile at the margin to consider the cost of transforming a parcel of land, however. By using the concept of ecosystem services, we can see the cost of transforming one type of land to another. This is something that has not historically been done by human societies, but now we might consider if we want to drain a wetland and turn that into a productive farmland, for example, that we are giving something up as well as gaining something. In the past, humankind has most often thought this is what we get, and the natural system was not valued at all. So all of the things I've spoken so far is again values in the human context. What of non-human values? This is an image of a Sumatran tiger. The systems I've spoken about fail to account for the intrinsic right of, say, this tiger to exist. Just as we value the intrinsic right of other people for their own autonomy, their own right to exist, their own right to make their own decisions, wouldn't it make sense that we could extend some of that ethic to non-human animals, plants, objects? So we ask in this case, do tigers have an intrinsic right to exist beyond the needs and desires of people? Now, like many philosophical questions, this can quickly become very complicated. If all tigers have an intrinsic right, what about other organisms, such as mosquitoes or bacteria? The bacteria that caused the Black Death is now considered extinct. Is that a problem? Should we be trying to bring the Black Death bacterium back? And of course, this concept can go beyond individual organisms or species. We can also consider other parts of the natural world. Humans often value things for aesthetic reasons, and here we have a beautiful arch from Arches National Park in the United States. So here we might be able to quantify its beauty value, and we might say, well, that's worth something to people. But does the natural landscape have its own value, even if it's not found aesthetically pleasing by people? This week, we're going to use metrics to try and measure progress or otherwise towards sustainability. But I want you to be aware that if we think about these ethical issues, we know that these metric approaches don't completely encompass what's important about sustainability. In the next lecture, we'll look at some of those sustainability metrics and see what kind of progress we're making.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.